Howdy folks, I again apologize for my long absence. At this point I'm just going to have to admit to myself that I'm not going to be able to keep a real schedule and just have to deal with it, so I apologize. Anyway, today I am going to be talking about abortion and specifically a secular viewpoint of it. I was raised Catholic. I don't consider myself Catholic anymore. I generally consider myself an agnostic, maybe a deist on a day I'm particularly inspired. So with that disclaimer out of the way, I consider myself to be anti-abortion. Again, not for any religious reasons. As such, I don't have any problem with contraception. Contraception is something that prevents a process from starting. It doesn't stop one. Next, I absolutely reject the idea that only women can have an opinion on this. First of all, it takes two people to make a baby. Two, there's something called empathy, which allows you to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Three, a lot of women have the same views as I do anyway. And four, for the purposes of this video, I now identify as a woman. So now my opinions are valid. Now I realize that abortion is a complicated topic. Even our laws are self-contradictory, which is to say you are both entitled to an abortion, but at the same time, if you murder a pregnant woman, in many states you can be charged for murder twice, and even on a federal level, there is a special act pertaining to pregnant women specifically. All this is to say that really nobody's on the same page, and due to the underlying philosophical question in which abortion revolves, I don't think anybody ever will be. So, the critical question is, when is a person a person? It's not immediately obvious, and the definition of a person hasn't always been the same. For example, through most of history, we had the institution of slavery, which is to say people weren't people, they were property. And even kids were regarded as property in most respects. They didn't have as many rights as adults, and if you had a debt to pay off, maybe you sold one of your kids into slavery. That was the way things worked back then. Obviously, things are a lot better now, and we regard children and babies with a certain reverence that they never had enjoyed in the past. Which is to say, if a child dies in an accident, we find that particularly tragic compared to if an adult dies, say. Even for those who are born, we have a lot of gray area over who we should and shouldn't kill. Those in persistent vegetative states, there's always controversy when somebody chooses to pull the plug. People who are brain dead are technically alive, but we don't consider them people anymore because the thing that makes them a person no longer exists. Even people on death row, there's a big controversy over the death penalty, whether or not we should kill somebody for grievous crimes. We can't even decide whether or not it's okay to help somebody kill themselves if they are in extreme pain and want to end their suffering. So why would we be able to decide on whether or not abortion is okay? All that is to say, I don't have any special revelation as to when a person becomes a person, but I can think of 2 points where somebody might decide a person is a person. One of those being birth and the other being conception. Obviously, if you are pro-choice, you think a person is a person when they're born. And if you are pro-life, you think a person is a person at conception. As I mentioned before, I am pro-life, which is to say I reject the notion that birth is a valid starting point to define personhood. And here's why. Regardless of whether or not you think a baby is a person before or after it's born, you have to admit that the process started at conception. And as such, birth is just a point on that development cycle. So what I mean to say is, developmentally speaking, what's the difference between a baby 1 minute before it's born and 1 minute after? Realistically, nothing. to take that point further, if a baby is born prematurely, is it okay to abort that baby up until the point it was supposed to be due? In my mind, of course not. This all feeds into the concept of viability, at which point so many people like to decide whether or not abortion is okay. Even if you could come up with a definition for something as vague as the concept of viability, there isn't a set point at which you could point and say, yes, this fetus is viable. You can no longer abort it. It's now a person. And even if you could, thanks to modern medicine, we have been able to change that point and shift it closer to conception. And it would be foolish to legislate a single point, because in the future that point might be irrelevant. Now, to turn to viability, in the US, viability means the ability of a fetus to survive outside the uterus while supported by modern medicine. Well, that's great. But if you are using viability as a metric for when you can or can't get an abortion, and if viability is a function of access to medicine, that necessarily means, depending on where you live and how much money you make, your definition of when you can get an abortion would be different than somebody else's if they make less money or more money, or they live in a better part of the country or a worse part of the country. And last I checked, rights are supposed to apply to equally to everyone. And if you use viability as the metric, I don't see how you could do that. With all this ambiguity, I think it's only proper that we err on the side of caution. When we are dealing with something as critical as the definition of humanity, we need to get it right. Because if we get it wrong, that's murder. Like I said, I don't know when a person becomes a person. I don't think I'm qualified to decide that. I don't think you are. I don't think anybody is. Otherwise, we would have figured it out by now. So to me, the only way I feel like we can be certain we have a clean conscience is to set that point at conception. Conception is the absolute start of a process. The end of that process is death. There's two absolute points in everybody's life: conception and death. Moving on to exceptions, I take a pretty hardline stance against them. I don't think there should be any exceptions for rape or incest, and here's why. There are a lot of people who are born of rape or incest or both, and yet once they're born, they're people like anyone else. So why wouldn't they have the same protections as anybody else before they're born, assuming you're pro-life? To me, the answer is you wouldn't. And to say there should be exceptions for rape or incest is to deny people who are already born of rape or incest their humanity. It's saying they're worse than the rest of us. They weren't worth being born in the first place. And that's unconscionable to me. That's terrible. The same goes for those who have mental or physical disabilities. If you were to tell me that a fetus has a 90% chance that it'll live an absolutely miserable life once it's born, that's something I can accept. But to me, it's a similar concept to letting 1,000 guilty people go free in order to make sure one innocent person doesn't get locked up. If there's a chance that somebody will wind up enjoying their life, regardless of their disability, regardless of the pain, I think that's absolutely something that should be provided. Otherwise, once they're born and they start growing up, that's a decision they should be able to make for themselves, whether or not they want to keep going. And I suspect that if you ask a lot of these people who were born with horrific disabilities and they are living through a lot of pain, a lot of them are going to tell you that they're glad to be alive, provided they can comprehend the question. But for us to decide for them before they have any say whatsoever is extremely egotistical to me, and it's sour, it's clinical, it's dispassionate. It's just sad and pessimistic to me. Really, the only exception I find acceptable is if you have to choose between the baby and the mother living, choose the mother. The mother already has memories, she has life experiences, she has relationships, she has ambitions, and that's not something any baby has. So to me, that one is okay, tragic though it may be. Now, all that said, there may be some other extreme cases in which terminating a pregnancy may be acceptable. I'm not talking about that right now. I'm talking about blanket policies. But I do accept that there may be other instances where it's appropriate. Now, on to some of the common soundbite arguments for abortion that I come across quite a bit, and why I don't think that they're acceptable either. It's just a clump of cells. Okay? You're just a clump of cells. Can I kill you? No. The pregnant woman may not be ready to have a baby. Well, okay. Don't have a baby. Don't get pregnant. There's a real easy way to not get pregnant. And even if you do get pregnant, nobody is saying that you have to keep the baby. Put it up for adoption. That leads to the next argument. Giving up a baby is condemning it to a terrible life in the foster system. Or not. It's pretty clear to me that a slim chance at a good life is a lot better than no chance at a good life at all. And even a poor life is pretty good in this country anyway, compared to what it has been throughout history. Either way, you couldn't possibly know that. And I remember being in an argument with somebody about this very topic in college. And one of the people in the group wound up going through the foster system and had a pretty damn good life. I mean, to say that their life is going to suck, as I previously mentioned, is a pretty poor excuse to keep somebody from experiencing it. So, in conclusion here, I don't hate people who are pro-choice. Like I said, if it were up to me, I think we should err on the side of caution. But, like I said, as well, I don't think anybody has the right answer to this. But at the same time, we also need to understand that there's a reason these people that are pro-choice are so passionate about their position. And if we want to really make progress on preventing abortion, we need to figure out what it would take to make it more palatable for these people to choose to carry their baby to term rather than abort it. And that's not something I think you can achieve with legislation. This is going to be something that requires a cultural shift. We need to make sure that if these people choose to have a baby, that they have the support they need in order to properly raise their child. Or if they choose to give their baby up, we need to make sure that if it winds up in the system, that it's going to have a good life. And that requires us to be more charitable. We're going to need to make some sacrifices of our own. I think it's pretty clear by now that I'm pretty libertarian on most things. And I don't think any of this should be forced. But we live in the richest country in the history of the world. And I think we have enough to go around to help these people cope with a situation that they're deeply uncomfortable with and turn it into something positive. Anyway, I realize that this is a bit of a long one, but that's all I got for today. I am very interested to hear your opinions, and depending on the responses, I might make a follow-up video. Anyway, thanks for watching, and have a good one. Ciao.